I walked into the library looking for a story, but she looked up, smiled, and suddenly, I was the one being read. The rain had been falling since morning, not harshly, but with that steady rhythm that makes the world feel slower, softer. By the time I reached the library, my shoes were damp and my notebook half-soaked, the ink bleeding like it was trying to escape the page. I pushed open the old wooden door, and warmth greeted me, the kind that wasn't just from the heaters, but from the hush that only libraries know how to hold. It smelled like paper and calm. The kind of scent that reminded you of childhood afternoons and stories you'd once believed could change your life. I came there looking for a book, maybe inspiration, maybe quiet, I wasn't sure. But the moment I saw her, everything in me went still. She stood behind the counter, arranging returned books in neat, practiced motions. Her hair, a soft chestnut touched by silver strands, was tied loosely, and a few tendrils framed her face with effortless grace. There was something precise about her, the way she moved, the way her eyes flicked up just long enough to meet mine before returning to her task. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice calm but warm, like it had learned long ago how to comfort without trying. I managed a smile. "Hi. Just looking around." She nodded, a small curve of her lips that made something in my chest shift. "Take your time. We don't rush stories here." That line, simple, almost routine, settled deep. Maybe she said it to everyone, but to me, it sounded like an invitation to breathe. As I wandered through the aisles, I found myself slowing down, not reading titles but watching her move in quiet rhythm with the room. There was something magnetic about her calmness. The world outside could be rushing, breaking, but in here, she was steady, a living bookmark holding the moment in place. At one point, she passed by the aisle where I stood, carrying a stack of books. The faint scent of her perfume, something subtle, floral, lingered as she walked past. I caught myself turning slightly, just enough to glimpse her expression as she worked. Focused, gentle, almost unreadable. I realized then that I wasn't looking for a book at all. I was looking for stillness, and she was the first person in a long time who made silence feel alive. When I finally checked out a novel I didn't intend to read, she smiled again. "Enjoy the story," she said. I almost told her, "I think I already have." I told myself I went back for the book. But when I pushed open the library doors a few days later, I knew that was only half true. The truth was simpler, harder to admit, I just wanted to see her again. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, spilling gold across the wooden floor. Everything looked the same, the soft hum of the old ceiling fan, the faint click of keys as she worked at her desk, the gentle rhythm of a place untouched by hurry. But when she looked up and saw me, something flickered behind her calm expression, recognition. Maybe even quiet surprise. "Back already?" she asked, adjusting her glasses. I smiled, trying not to sound too eager. "The book you gave me was good. Thought I'd find another." Her lips curved slightly, that same calm smile I'd thought about more than I should have. "You finished it quickly." "I might have been more interested in how it began," I said before realizing how that sounded. Her brows lifted, amused. She didn't reply, just nodded and turned toward the shelves. I followed, pretending to browse as she moved gracefully between the aisles. Her fingertips traced the spines of books as though she could read their stories through touch alone. There was something soothing about her movements, deliberate, steady, unhurried. "Try this one," she said softly, pulling a worn hardcover from the shelf and handing it to me. Our fingers brushed. Just for a second, but it was enough to make time hesitate. It wasn't a spark, not the kind that jolts you. It was gentler, a quiet awareness, like finding warmth where you didn't expect it. She must have felt it too, her eyes flicked up to meet mine, then quickly away. The moment passed, folded neatly between the silence and the shelves. I found myself watching her when she wasn't looking. The way her hair slipped loose from its tie when she leaned forward to stack books. The soft hum she made under her breath, maybe a tune, maybe just her way of thinking. Every detail felt like a secret the library was sharing only with me. When I left that day, she didn't say goodbye, just a small nod, her gaze lingering half a second longer than before. It was nothing, really. But walking home, I realized I'd never felt more seen without a single word being spoken. And somehow, that silence spoke louder than anything else could. It was nearing closing time when I stopped by again. The sky outside was fading to a muted violet, and the air had that crisp, almost tender stillness that only arrives before nightfall. I hadn't planned to stay, just to return a book and maybe, selfishly, hear her voice again. But as I stepped inside, the lights were dimmer than usual. The sign on the counter read, "Closed for reshelving." She stood at the far end of the room, sleeves rolled to her elbows, moving a box of books that was clearly heavier than it should have been. "Need a hand?" I asked, breaking the quiet. She turned, startled for just a moment, then smiled, that same soft, grounded smile I'd begun to wait for. "You shouldn't be here after hours." "I'll take that as a yes," I said, stepping forward before she could protest. She hesitated, then exhaled through a small laugh, the kind that slips out when someone's guard finally lowers. "All right," she said. "But just this once." We worked side by side under the warm glow of a single desk lamp. The rest of the library had sunk into shadow, aisles fading into a comfortable darkness. The world outside didn't exist here, only the soft thud of books finding their shelves, the low hum of the heater, and the faint brush of her sleeve against mine when we moved too close. Now and then, our hands reached for the same spot. Once, our shoulders touched, barely, accidentally, and yet, I felt it like a quiet jolt that steadied rather than startled me. At one point, she rested against a shelf, catching her breath. "I used to love nights like this," she said. "When I first started here, I'd stay after hours just to read. I thought I'd write someday, maybe something small, something honest." Her voice grew softer. "But life got busy. You know how that goes." I looked at her then, really looked. The lamplight softened her features, touched the faint lines around her eyes, and made her seem both strong and beautifully human. "Maybe you just need the right reason to start again," I said. She met my gaze, searching, almost as if testing whether I meant it. "Maybe," she whispered, her tone more confession than reply. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, of things neither of us said, and of a warmth neither of us denied. When she finally turned off the lamp, she smiled faintly. "Thank you for the help," she murmured. I wanted to say anytime, but the truth was, I already hoped there'd be one. When I walked into the library that morning, I wasn't expecting her to already be waiting. Yet there she was behind the counter, a faint smile tugging at her lips as though she'd known I'd come back. The soft light of the early sun streamed through the tall windows, dust particles floating lazily in the beams. The world outside was noisy, but inside, time still moved at her pace, calm, patient, deliberate. Without a word, she reached beneath the counter and brought out a book wrapped in brown paper. Her fingertips brushed the paper's edge before sliding it toward me. "I kept this one aside," she said, her tone quiet but purposeful. "Thought you might like it." I blinked, caught between gratitude and surprise. "You picked something for me?" Her eyes lifted, steady and kind. "It's about listening, to people, to yourself." I thought it might fit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of a distant page turning filled the gap. I unwrapped the paper slowly, careful not to tear it. Inside was an old copy of Letters to a Young Poet, the edges were worn, the spine faintly cracked, a book that had been read, felt, and maybe loved. "You've read it?" I asked, running a hand over the faded cover. "Many times," she said softly. "It's different each time. The words don't change, but you do." Our hands met briefly as she passed it fully into my grasp, her skin warm, her touch fleeting but grounding. The contact was so brief that it could have been nothing. Yet I felt it echo, a silent underline to a sentence I hadn't realized she'd written in the air between us. I wanted to say something, about how she somehow knew what I needed before I did. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, meeting her eyes for a heartbeat longer than politeness required. She looked away first, smoothing the hem of her sweater, though I caught the smallest hint of color rising in her cheeks. "Well," she murmured, "you'll have to tell me what you think." "I will," I promised. As I walked out, the wrapped paper still in my hand, I realized what felt strange. She had given me a book about listening, yet somehow it was she who had already heard me best. And somewhere between those shelves, a quiet understanding had begun to turn its own first page. The storm began just as the sun disappeared. By the time I reached the library, the streets shimmered with rain, and the wind was loud enough to bend the trees outside. I didn't plan to stay long, just return her book and maybe catch a glimpse of that calm that always seemed to live here, even when the rest of the world rushed past. When I stepped inside, the lights flickered. The space was nearly empty, except for her, standing by the reading table near the window, gathering scattered papers. She looked up, surprised but not displeased. "You walked here in this?" she said, smiling faintly. "I didn't expect the weather to turn," I replied, brushing the water from my hair. "Well," she said, glancing toward the window streaked with rain, "looks like you're staying until it eases." The power blinked once, then again, and went out completely. A hush fell, deep and complete. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind and the rhythmic tapping of rain against glass. Then she reached into a drawer, pulled out a small reading lamp, and turned the knob until a soft, amber light filled the space between us. "Better," she murmured. We sat close, both leaning slightly toward the glow. The world beyond the lamp's circle seemed to fade, the aisles, the storm, everything. The light caught the faint lines around her eyes, the silver strands in her hair. I'd never noticed how warm her presence felt until that moment, with the darkness pressing gently around us. She opened a book between us, Letters to a Young Poet, the same one she had given me. "You said you finished it," she said. "Tell me what you thought." I said slowly, "it wasn't about advice. It was about learning how to feel again." She looked at me then, not with curiosity, but with that quiet, searching gaze that made it hard to look anywhere else. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "That's the hardest thing, isn't it? Letting yourself feel." Her words seemed to float in the space between us, delicate as the sound of rain. We sat in that stillness, our shoulders almost touching, the air heavy with everything unspoken. She began reading aloud, her voice low and measured, tracing each word like it mattered. At one point, her hand brushed mine, not by accident this time, but softly, intentionally. When she stopped reading, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, of breath, and closeness, and 1,000 things neither of us dared to name. And in that golden hush, I realized, she wasn't just reading the book anymore. She was reading me. The next day, the rain had stopped, but the quiet between us hadn't. I told myself I was just returning a borrowed book, yet every step toward the library carried the same nervous pulse I used to feel before something important, something I couldn't quite name. When I walked in, she was there, as always, but different. Her hair was tied back tighter, her voice a little quieter when she greeted me. The calmness was still there, but beneath it was something I hadn't seen before, hesitation. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound casual. She nodded, eyes dropping to the desk. "Good morning. You didn't have to come today, I know you finished the book." "I wanted to return it in person," I replied, placing it gently on the counter. The paper wrapping she'd used was still folded neatly around it. "And to thank you." She smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. For a moment, she busied herself with the return log, her fingers fidgeting slightly with the pen. Then she exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Last night," she began, her voice softer than usual. "I think maybe I blurred a line." I blinked. "What line?" She looked up then, meeting my gaze. There was no librarian's composure, no practiced stillness, only honesty. "The one between being kind and being too close," she said. "You came here for books, and she stopped, shaking her head slightly. "Sometimes I forget that people like you still notice people like me." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "Clara," I said quietly, "you're the reason I started noticing again." She froze. Her name, seemed to shift the air between us. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "You came for a book, but somehow, you started reading me instead." Her voice trembled at the edges, carrying both fear and wonder. I took a step closer, not enough to cross a line, but enough for her to feel that I was listening. "Then let me keep reading," I said. Slowly. Carefully. "Only as much as you let me." Something in her expression softened, relief, maybe, or recognition. Her eyes glistened in the filtered light. "You always know how to turn silence into poetry," she murmured. I smiled faintly. "Only because you taught me how." Outside, sunlight slipped through the windows, catching the dust in quiet spirals. Between us, there was still distance, but it no longer felt like separation. It felt like the kind of pause that happens before a sentence worth remembering. Weeks passed, and the library began to feel less like a place I visited and more like a rhythm I'd learned to move within. The whisper of turning pages, the faint hum of the old heater, the way afternoon light softened everything into gold, all of it became familiar, like chapters in a story that was still being written. Clara and I had found a quiet balance after that confession. We didn't speak of it again, yet everything we said afterward seemed to carry a gentler weight. She would recommend books she thought might suit my mood, and I would leave her small notes tucked between their pages, reflections, lines of poetry, sometimes just a single word, "Thank you." One evening, as the last of the visitors left and the sky deepened to indigo, I stayed behind, helping her stack a few final returns. She moved slower these days, not from weariness, but from intention. Every gesture seemed deliberate, as if she didn't want to hurry the moment. When we were done, she sat down at the reading table, resting her elbows lightly on the wood. "You're writing again," she said, glancing at the notebook I always carried. I nodded. "You were right. I just needed someone, to remind me that words don't have to be perfect to be true." She smiled at that, a soft, genuine curve that seemed to come from somewhere deep. "Can I read one?" I hesitated, then handed her a few pages. My handwriting looked uncertain next to her calm presence. As she began to read aloud, the sound of her voice filled the quiet, low, steady, and full of care. It wasn't just that she was reading my words, it was the way she gave them life, shaping each sentence like she was tasting it for the first time. At one point, she paused and looked up. "You wrote about the rain," she said. "About that night." I met her gaze. "It's where the story began." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe this is where it continues." For a moment, the library felt suspended in that single heartbeat, the soft ticking of the clock, the amber pool of lamplight, the warmth of her hand resting gently over mine. Not searching. Not asking. Just there. Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, familiar. She leaned back, still holding my pages. "You came for a book," she whispered, echoing her old words with a faint smile, "but it seems we've been writing one instead." And sitting there beside her, in the quiet heart of the library, surrounded by stories, I realized ours had finally found its last line. Headphone if you felt the story linger after it ended, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more slow burn, age gap romances that whisper instead of shout. Books because sometimes, the softest stories are the ones that stay.